sick of the crazy? Are you tired of the lies? Well, maybe it's time to get ready for the Republic of the Real, because it's about to get real. As for people, so too it is for nations. Kingdoms of Sandstone. Author, Max Daves, co-founder Othio Strategic Advanced Intelligence. August 17, 2019. Foundational worldview. The absurdity of this world is seen in its refusal to learn from history and one's own mistakes. This is true for both people and nations. We all have this vulnerability. The confusion which reigns supreme over our nation is clearly seen in its effects and outcomes. Nothing has caused more suffering than the rejection of truth and love lived out from the humble and contrite heart. For this reason, the very notions of justice and mercy have become polluted by perspective inversion and corrupted counterfeits. The result is a society which cannot discern even the most basic concepts which can preserve and uphold it. Without the authentic Jesus, we have as a nation created a myriad of Jesus counterfeits which suit our personal preferences, creating a myth out of a truth embodied in the historical personage of the Son of God. Without the divine logos and the spirit of truth, we bequeath to ourselves confusion upon confusion from the written word, even as we deny the living word. What is rushed in to fill the void are shadows of the authentic. The hallowing out of the gospel lived out in community and the broader nation has left us with but a remnant of living authentic believers. It has also left us with a kingdom without the king, where each individual acts as their own sovereign, ruling over all things from the bubble of their own self-generated disreality, fashioned of temporality, worshipping all that is temporary and fleeting. All kingdoms built on temporal from temporality will always yield but temporary gains due to the foundations on which they are built. Cruelty is a function of fear and hatred born of lust, greed and pride forged and reinforced by lies and machinations. One can easily see the avarice and hubris throughout all history. Only the truth and love brings about justice and mercy from humble and contrite hearts. The same holds true for peoples and nations. History has clearly illustrated the human vulnerabilities leading to the propensity towards shadows of the real. Even so, there have always been a remnant in each generation who sought the truth and found it. The remnant are those who are set free from the inside out by the Spirit of truth, though they have had to live with the same propensities we all struggle with in mortal coils. The salvation and redemption of humanity from the darkness of lies and its chains thereof is only found in the gift of salvation in the truth of the divine Logos, which always transcends the works and wisdom of the way of the empires. Born of those same mortal coils, it is the truth which sets one free from the chains of the lies and corruption thereof. The lies always bring us in order to chain people to. No one is smart enough, pure enough, or strong enough in their own wisdom and works to overcome their spiritual malady. You cannot work for gift. You can only accept it or refuse it. One reveals humility and the other exposes pride and self-deception. Salvation is not built upon one's innate mortal capabilities and works. It is a gift offered to all who would accept it. God did this for good reason. It levels the ground for all and exposes the pride and insufficiencies apart from acceptance of the gift. God's love and respect for his creation, chief among creation being humanity, gives all humanity the choice. He does not force people to accept grace and the ultimate grace of the gift of salvation in the divine Logos, as the despotic darkness tries to do in attempting to deceive people by lies in order to enslave them to its degenerate destructive intents. The Tao of the autocrat and their despotic regimes are examples of the lie playing out in human history, revealing the insufficiency of the lies and the prideful hearts from which they are born. They promise so much and deliver so little for such a short time. They never stand the test of time because they cannot stand against the truth which exposes them regardless of what they do to hide it, fight it, or eliminate it from their temporary sandstone kingdoms. Just as sandstone can appear to be a strong foundation on which to build until it is tested over time by fire, water, ice, wind, and earthquakes, so too are the kingdoms of this world who weaken over time due to their insufficient foundations and inherent vulnerabilities, which are always vulnerable to the same things all people are: lies, temptation, deception, confusion, pride, greed, corruption, and division. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. What is created by the vulnerable will be vulnerable. What is created by the corruptible will be vulnerable to corruption. What is built of temporal substance and limited temporal-based mortal wisdom and works will always be temporary. History reveals these things clearly, yet each generation is led astray into darkness which blinds them in mind to the wrongness and peril of their way, having not learned from history at large or their own pasts individually. The spirit of the age wages war against each generation, using their mortal vulnerabilities against them to first tempt, then ensnare and enslave them to the fear born of being made slaves to that which their minds have been blinded to, that they might be devoured and destroyed to sustain the lie of that dark zeitgeist. In this world, the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations are dominated by the darkness of the spirit of the age, which co-opts all they create and attempt to take those things by force in order to use it against them as instruments to dominate them in cruelty. This is meta-war waged against every generation to keep them in the darkness, not seeing their perilous predicament until they are enslaved and made to serve the lie which it is. The despotic regime is merely the outworking of the nation-state's reflection of the meta-enslavement of its constituency by the spirit of the age. The existential internal reality becomes the externalized reality when critical mass is reached in a society. It is the result of the aggregated desolation of individuals which is encapsulated in the perversion of the state over the individuals and the peoples by the state. The cyclical feedback loop self-reinforces its control in the illusion of the synthetic cultural reality and the enforced faux social contract. All of society devolves into a system of lies upheld by reinforcement systems which promote lies as truth while denying the actual truth. The nature of a lie is one bent on exploiting and deceiving the generations by means of the corruptible nature of their mortal coils. The lie makes proxies out of people who are often blinded in their deception to how they are being co-opted and used both against their own best interests, as well as that of others. The lie convinces those under its influence the rightness of their wrongness, inverting their perceptions and actions. It works upon their pride and lacking sense of identity to eventually use both against them, even as it uses them to achieve the goals and objectives of the lie. What are those goals and objectives? Well, to divide and conquer people, places, and things, then devour and destroy. Its intent is absolute control over all creation, to rule it as the absolute hegemonic power ruling through a domination system of co-opted and defeated governance systems. It desires to infiltrate and take over all 7 spheres of societal influence and transformation. That is why we call it the beast which comes from the bottomless pit. More is never enough for its appetites, for its hunger is infinite, which it is attempting to satisfy using temporal means and methods. There is not enough finite temporality to fill the hungers of an infinite appetite. This is seen in addictions. Addiction is an example of both how the addict is a slave to a lie which consumes them and the nature of the beast of addiction which is devouring them. The fracturing of national narratives and the fabrication of an insufficient replacements. The erosion of the acceptance of objective truth. A portent of dark days, objective truth and justice is overarching in a meta-societal reality, not a function of societal formulated desires and understanding. The application of and resulting ethical restraints on the society by the society regarding overarching objective truth is where we have a problem. The confusion which results by having departed from even the notion of objective truth and justice creates the environment for abuses of power and limiting of broad-based opportunities for citizens. Here wherein is the paradox. The lack of a cohesive national worldview tethered to objective truth and justice leaves the researcher, the business person, the politician, and the soldier alike without a sufficient morally sound and ethical founded structural framework that can offset the problems which arise in brutal subjectivism or its not so identical twin, brutal utilitarianism. What if the majority is corrupted and fractured in their understanding of what is good and what is evil? What is birthed is a state of confusion, forced conformity, bitterness, and insanity. The People's Republic of Absurdum Absinthium. De musicis rebus non discutium de personalis preferences. The same goes with small groups who decide that their subjective point of view supersedes that of the majority, or even rationality. What this leads to is the tyranny of personal preferences and their codification into societal institutions by the dictatorial elitists, who play the role of the priests and priestesses of the not-so-new cult of self. The rise to preeminence of a deified me, myself, and I pantheon then seeks to consolidate their adherents, those seeking cajole them into action against all that previously had been accepted in upholding society when it was still viable and sane. They gain favor with their cultified constituencies by elevating weaponized subjectivism and personal preferences to the high holy status of compelled doctrine and unquestionable dogma, having raised the degenerate to absurd heights in the public discourse and centers of power. They next embark upon a systematic war of attrition against any perceived vestiges of the prior societal norms which they deem as a threat against their absolutist personal autonomy which reigns, in their thinking at least, as the sole sovereign power over all things. The cult of the new religion needs a potentate externalized from their projections which can reflect their own glory back upon them. Now here is where the pageantry of their individual and collective delusions of grandeur hit the wall of reality, being that each is entitled to be both their own potentate and follower. Finding actual consensus breaks down to a point of utter maddening paralysis. The paralysis as such makes toxic any hope to move the nation, much less these pitiful souls' cult of personal preferences, forward towards any meaningful actionable plan that might have success solving the most pressing national problems. Why is this? Well, in lieu of the banality of majoring on the minors where they might find some level of agreement, their only option is retreat back to each one's one sovereign will, however incongruent it may be. Such is a recipe for disillusionment, dissolution, and ultimately fracturing of the illusion of cohesion, which was but a shadowy counterfeit of that which they sought to replace when they embarked upon their great crusade to begin with. You see, the problem with such a worldview is that personal preferences are not sufficient to build a cohesive social contract with based on anything resembling a firm foundation from which to build one's power base. They are called personal preferences for a reason. A preference is not a transferable objective concept, nor is it bound to being static. Preferences are subject to change at the whim of the individual. Transience is an abject, absurd thing on which to build a lasting social contract with. After all, each person has their own preferences, which are also all subject to transience, thusly not providing for anything but temporary and fractured cohesion with which to achieve a necessary unified movement that can achieve absolutely and maintain absolute power over the society. Personality fracturing externalized into fractured societal cohesion. Moral and ethical restraints can and do fracture in such a vacuum, leading to abuses of people, position, opportunities, and power. The confusion and eventual chaos which results only amplifies the totality of the whole downward trajectory. No nation nor organization or even individual can truly function in a healthy, productive, and free manner under the specter of such teamation disorder. No secure nor prosperous society can be maintained in it either. Brute force alone is not sufficient to safeguard the greater good of the society. The greater good must be resident in the society at large and the citizenry to uphold the virtues which maintain freedom and liberty within a cohesive and shared fundamental worldview built upon truth, love, justice, mercy, humility, and service to one another. Our communities and the nation, When this is removed as the keystone in society, there be no part of that society which will not be corrupted by what rushes in to fill the great void left in its wake. Once the breach in the flood wall has occurred, the resulting torrent of insufficient, even hostile and destructive influences rush through the breach, bringing with it innumerable national afflictions and sufferings. The breach is not easily repaired. Indeed, it has rarely been mitigated in the nations previous whom ventured too far from proper foundations. However, it can be mitigated in the short term and transformed over time. Let's look at how we can do that. The toxicity pathology. The importance of shared authentic experiences to a shared cohesive community narrative. Relationships breathe life into authentic narratives. A shared worldview provides a foundation of common ground for people of like or similar shared beliefs, experiences, and interests. All worldviews are not equal, but many have areas of commonly held beliefs. Some will take issue with this statement because they have accepted a false common ground by wrongly assigning equivalence to all perspectives, beliefs, and ideologies. They will say that all religions are the same, ignoring the fact that if all religions were in fact the same, there would not be multiple religions, but rather one singular one with uniformity of beliefs. This would of course be delusional. Every religion is so precisely because of their differences, regardless of shared commonalities in various aspects. Each religion claims some form of exclusivity based upon internally accepted differentiations, or else they would be assimilated by others. Those who try to smooth out these differences are engaging in a particular form of projected worldview homogenization, which is often called syncretism. Interestingly, syncretism has its etymological origin in the Cretan word syncretizine, meaning unite against a third party. Now, what do you suppose this third party is? Well, in this case, it would be against a third party of the original contextual accuracy of the various things being united falsely on faulty grounds. This means they have to water down the essentials of each component to be amalgamated into the new harmonized and unified structure. To do this, the syncretists have to dilute each component down and make alterations to them sufficient enough to create the appearance of sameness to fit their narratives. In doing so, they actually distort and deny parts of these systems of belief in order to reconstruct within the intended syncretized uniformity to fit their personal wishes without regard to the logic or respect of those who are within those various belief systems. So it can be said that the syncretists are actually attempting to create an alternative version of the actual things in order to unite them against the truth of the original things. Being that they have to water those belief systems down to achieve the unified soft amalgam, their new construct is even weaker than those components and their individual strengths and weaknesses were to begin with. These kinds of ideological constructs are subject to short-duration lifespans due to accelerated entropic effects born of both the means and methods used to manufacture it in the first place. They are in effect making a copy of a copy, with successive copies weakening further. Likewise, nothing disarms false narratives like that of looking at them in reverse, seeing them as potential projections from the source, exposing what they are themselves are doing, have done, or are planning to do, and founded accusations reveal the fears of the accusers projected. They often point out the reflection of themselves in the visage of others, which triggers their fear of being exposed. In other cases, the source of the accusations are deceived by false information or by confirmation bias, which is born from deceptions and faulty perceptions triggering a fight or flight response. It is this paradigm which we now find our mortal coils bombarded by and our souls vexed with the binarium of the simulacrum, the cycle of the rise and the fall of the elite classes. Over the course of time, there always arises in every nation-state the inevitability of an elite class which departs from its roots and foundations, having forgotten their lowly estate, from which they were once freed. The gradual eroding away of this remembrance creates a chasm between those whom they rose above and themselves now in their lofty and powerful positions. This chasm, when allowed to congeal and harden into rigid social strata over the successive generations, eventually gathers to these elites a great bounty of wealth and power to such a degree that it chokes off all others from upward mobility, opportunity, and influence in their own affairs, even as it strips them of freedom and liberty to make their objections known. It is in this fragile state that the nation and its elite class is tested, for the conditions wrought upon the land surfaces what the elite and all others truly value in their heart and minds. For it is there the cohesion of the values which guards and holds up the state are birthed and sustained or withered by the avarice and hubris of pride and fear. It is the great temptation of the elite to allow their blind ambitions and will to power to deceive themselves into creating their loss. This occurs when they see those whom they have charge over as threats to their prestige and power rather than the foundations upon which they are able to have their perch among the heights of the land. It is here many of the elite conspire with their fears and in their pride to spin intrigues with which to first manipulate, then subjugate their fellow citizens, having gotten their own roots among them in the stupor of their prosperity and successes. This galvanizes those beneath them to action, fomenting rebellion against the now tyrannical ruling class. Over time, elaborate and complex systems of state as well as contextually corrupted systems of thought are developed to keep these unwieldy masses at bay, that the elites might in one hand placate them and on the other hand lord over them in the shadows through intrigues and machinations. This knowledge surfaces at key points in the lifetime of a nation-state when such an elite class has gained sufficient power and wealth along with control over the 7 spheres of societal influence. A darkness covers the hearts and the minds of the ruling caste with a thick delusion born of the prevailing zeitgeist already feeding on the peoples of other nation-states. This abominable phantom moves over the land like an obsidian fog, blinding the peoples to the coming harvest of destruction brought about by the maturing of the pride and greed resident in the complacent and complicit. It is often in the convergence of these times you will see great confrontations stirred up between peoples, tribes and nations by their ruling classes as a means of diversion. One might say it is rather akin to a sacrifice of peoples on the temple of Mammon on the bloody altar of homage to the elite's idol. History reveals this rerunning of the neo-ball cycle repeatedly in all the nations. The masses are treated like cattle to be led to their slaughter by their ruling class masters. People are deceived into the resulting great darkness which befalls the nation-states, convincing them to offer up their children to the hideous beast which rises up to devour human flesh in wars, famine, economic depravities, pestilence, and all manner of destructive vices which feeds death through the widening of the mouth of the grave. A kind of madness takes hold of the peoples, tribes, and nations that drives them towards the basest of human desire in an orgy of depravity and destruction. Even still, the majority of the ruling elite appease their god of destruction long enough to live again for the next cycle until the grave eventually demands of them their souls. Reality in the valley of the shadows and decision. When the people, top to bottom, stop living in the shadows of the authentic and realize the futility of having done so, they will start the journey towards that which supersedes the counterfeit that even now has them chained to a destructive illusion. One cannot expect the echo of something to suffice when the actuality of that something which the echoes emanated from awaits its rediscovery and recompense. So it is in matters of state and of the heart and the mind. The counterfeits always leave you emptied, sullied and broken after having promised so much and delivered to you so very little. For it at the lure which drew you into its deceptive gravity well, it is but a lie fashioned from the shadow of the real thing. This is the paradox of this world and this time. The mirages are called real and the real are called mirages. The games that peoples, tribes, and nations play to salve conscience is a poor whitewash to cover the inevitable revealing of the consequences beneath its false light outward appearances. Be it the state or of business or of personal matters, the truth of things do eventually emerge regardless of the energies and intrigues spent to fig leaf that outcome. In the end, all will be found to be both liar and sinner all the same, with the one difference being those who know it and hate it and those who know it and deny it, though it be known to all already. I know of not one single person who is without the need for grace and understanding, including myself. I am certainly not infallible, nor are many of those who are quite adept ignoring their own fallibility, even as they are so quick to cast aspersions on others with no thought as to their potential rightness on any given point of view. Duplicity in the politisphere of civil government. The case for mitigating the erosion of the Constitution. To those in the government, those making the laws of the land must also be held accountable to those laws equally with all citizens. Those who are elected to office and create and pass laws which grant them exemption while imposing them upon the body politic which elected them and placed them into their positions, is a breach of the public trust and amounts to a subversion of the public good by the very ones sworn to uphold and protect that public good. A threat by one held to one standard while allowing a different standard to be applied to another is duplicitous. In this such case, a clear and present threat, as presumed by those in elected offices who are also fig-leaving their own actions while cajoling the public and at times even provoking the citizenry to threats against them. While you have created a situation which presents a legitimate threat to the very public you provoke. In doing so, I would say that you have exercised your office wrongly by seeking to impose protections for yourselves while placing in jeopardy that of the citizenry whom you have placed into an adversarial role by your own decisions and lawmaking. This represents an erosion of the public good and wise governance while operating in a duplicitous manner that infringes upon the rights, freedoms, and liberties of the body politic. Your actions thereby represent a threat to that same body politic which your duplicity has manufactured in spurious legal maneuvers leading to a misapplication of the law, governance, and the justice system sworn to uphold it. One might say this to be not only a breach of your duties and responsibilities as granted by the people who elected you and the general citizenry at large, but also sedition. This makes your position even more precarious, considering that you are also the ones which sought to protect yourselves by one application of the law while denying that to those who you represent in government, which again submit to you, is yet another breach of the public trust, as well as a clear and present threat to the integrity of the civil authority of the government and the rights, freedoms, and liberties of the citizenry. That constitutes the grounds for removal from office and court proceedings to determine to what degree you engaged in spurious activities, even machinations harmful to American people, the government itself, and the of the Constitution with the freedoms protected therein. That means that you are by your own decisions and actions in jeopardy of becoming an enemy of the state. If this is the case, and you have both compromised the laws of the land as well as perverted the judicial system which must interpret and enforce those said laws, then it is not only the right of the public but also the responsibility of the citizens of the nation to seek your removal from office and prosecution for having undermined the foundations for a free and just system of government and the enforcement of laws which you sought to compel the citizenry to be complicit with. That is quite simply your predicament. You then should consider yourself caught in your own trap and seek to make restitution lest the consequences scale immeasurably, refusing to do so. Truth and justice for all does in fact mean for all. That does not allow for it to be reinterpreted as being some while absolving those in power or beholden to them. Specifically on the issue of hate speech and threats levied against those in governmental positions, it is a subversion of the freedom of speech by the very government which the public has the right to voice dissent towards when such a government passes laws which embolden it to suppress the freedoms and liberties of the citizenry outlined clearly in the federal Constitution. We must question your intent on having instituted such duplicitous laws. Is that also to be considered a threat? Perhaps it should be considered as such. One guaranteed by the highest law of the land, the U.S. Constitution. For the rights therein are a threat to those who would seek to subvert it, and the Americans for which it does stand for as a bulwark against the very things some among the ruling elite see as a threat to their personal proclivities, preferences, corruptive, coercive, questionable, and unprincipled activities. It is means to be so. To undermine it reveals a threat to the public whose intent must be questioned in the same manner which you seek to arrest, imprison, and question citizens who you deem a threat to your subjective interpretation and equal application of the law for your own benefit. A threat does not constitute intent. To state that it unequivocally does erodes jurisprudence, legal process, the presumption of innocence, habeas corpus, and proper evidential-based law. It leaves the citizen vulnerable to subjective, potentially politicized, and even weaponized interpretation of both the speech and intent without consideration of other facts and evidence. For the public accept and remain complicit with and observe such laws as to accept an erosion of civilian rights while protecting those infringing upon them under hate speech or some other spurious reasoning and poorly conceived legal maneuvers which I cannot and will not support for the good of all our fellow citizens in our republic. The death of a republic, autoimmune political disease, a spiritual virus of pride and corruption. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Autoimmune diseases essentially divide and use the body against itself. An autoimmune disease is when the body becomes the target of its own defensive arsenal. Medicine must step in, or a natural immunity must be built up which can fight it off and then keep the body protected from further incursions. The complex network of cells and proteins that make up our immune system is an invaluable ally. Foreign invaders that would do us harm, such as viruses, are subject to intense assault by immune cells to keep us safe. Sometimes, however, this powerful defensive armory turns against us. Immune attack against healthy tissues, known as autoimmunity, is thought to play a part in more than 80 different diseases, including type 1 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, and lupus. Tens of millions of people are affected by these chronic disorders in the United States alone. And although it is often possible to manage the debilitating symptoms, they cannot typically be cured. But researchers are getting closer to working out how to bring the immune system back on side. Now consider all of that written above as metaphors for political, intellectual, spiritual, and ethical reality in a nation. Consider it in terms of unrestricted and hybrid warfare, foreign influence operations and operators, as well as corruption sowing strategies and tactics acts like the COVID-19 is to the human body. So too it is for unprincipled and corrupt people and organizations in a nation. Their intrigues and machinations are designed to turn the state against itself. The state against the people and the people against the state. Doesn't it seem like parts of the body politic and the political ruling class are acting like the coronavirus, attempting to turn the body's own immune system in defenses against itself while attacking the vital organs of governance and rule of law? Are you not seeing corrupt ideological cell groups being used as proxies against the entire body politic? Are not the defenses against this being rendered impotent, blocked, or co-opted into becoming proxies in this viral infection? Think about how terrorist and criminal cells work in a community or a nation. Think about how covert foreign actors operate in a country to conduct influence operations which are meant to compromise it. When the government and various elements within the security apparatus are compromised at the ability of the systems which are to defend against such hostile threats to the health and well-being of the nation at large and the institutions which must govern it. Nations, like people, are vulnerable to both literal and figurative pathogens. An example of this can be seen in the drug epidemic, which are borders. Cities and neighborhoods flooded by toxins and the myriad of social cascade effects which follow. There is a reason we use the term epidemic for such things. A widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. A disease widely occurring in a community at a particular time. A sudden, widespread occurrence of a particular undesirable phenomenon. The word comes from the early 17th century. From French epidemic, from epidemie, via late Latin from Greek epidemia, prevalence of disease, from epidemios, prevalent. From epi upon plus demos, the people. What are nations composed of? People. What gets infected in a disease? People. What happens in a widespread occurrence of disease? It is transmitted to large numbers of people. Note how the language is here. Do we not call COVID-19 a communicable disease? See here how information and disease use the same language and follow similar pathways to spread. Communicably, it is transmitted to others. Now consider how information is disseminated. Our technology is used to broadcast various types of media content to communicate various kinds of information in data packets. Likewise, a virus is akin to a data packet which transmits its data into the host and replicates itself like malicious code in the body of an infected person, where it continues the infection process spreading throughout the body. This replication process is the increasing compromising of the individual and their ability of their immune system defenses to fight off the onslaught. The viral infection escalates attempting to overwhelm the host. The immune system also escalates attempting to mitigate and eliminate the threat. In some autoimmune diseases, the pathogen actually moves through these phases and actually uses the immune system response against its own host. Now consider these concepts as metaphors for the failed or failing nation states. There is a reason why such failing and failed states move towards being intervened upon externally or from internal forces which have had some short-term success for stabilizing the patient. In this case being the nation state. However, in most cases, both of these approaches work against the nation, leading to a greater infection which can eventually kill the nation state through sudden destruction or a prolonged death march to its end with nearly constant conflict and cycles of suffering and destruction. Empires generally go through the latter. In that case, it is generally a long-duration illness. Also, in many cases, what finally kills the patient is actually fear-driven choices by leaders who blindly attempt to treat the patient in a manner which may seem right to them. However, it actually is highly destructive, which exponentially worsens the already diseased condition. If no rational intervention occurs, the nation, like the individual, will reach a terminal condition where death is assured. The irony is the government, as such, dies long before those who fill out its ranks and those whom are governed actually recognize, until the end stench of the rotting corpse becomes so pungent it can no longer be denied. The corpse of failed governance is seen in those unwilling to admit that has passed away, and what is left to us but a shell taking up space where some else needs to be. If we are to remain wedded to what is no longer useful for the governance of this nation, then I will have to look elsewhere for a coalition of the willing to get things done without encumbrances of the briar patch that this government has become in its desolation. Tell me this, whose law is higher in authority? That of God's law, or the rules and regulations of a corrupted government who is and has been failing to do what it was created to do? Is it not God Almighty who set up the civil authorities to administer governance? And what if the civil authorities end state if it has deviated from its intended purposes for being in place? The problem here is one of risk. No one these days wishes to risk what it takes to actually extract the people and the nation alike from those unprincipled and even incompetent ones who have co-opted the institutions of governance. No change of predicaments come without risk and dangers. It is a problem when all are enmeshed in a briar patch of thorns and thistles born of a bureaucratic system which has been weaponized against us. We cannot continue to pretend it is not. The obvious nature of it has been made clear to all who have eyes to see and ears to hear. It is an apostate government. If those charged with fighting against what has co-opted it are too fearful to push back upon it, then they must resign themselves also to the fact they have also played a part in the death of this republic. It will fall regardless, if those of courage and of keen intellect do not, or best said, are prevented from doing what they have been endowed by God to do for the good of all. Thus I can only say that the resulting consequences to the nation at large will be more calamity until such time as those stumbling blocks are removed or the dissolution of the nation occurs. All that you wish to rescue by the self-deception of complicity and denial will be ceded to it in the end, lest you turn from appeasing it. For the beast will not grow less ravenous. Oh no, it will in fact expand its hungers until it has nothing left to devour but its own relics. Thus is the nature of a beast and of the bottomless pit from whence it does come from. Such things cannot be appeased, only defeated and subjugated. Nothing can rescue you from its beastly snare of comfortable complacency, nor its demands for compliant capitulation, if you do not first admit the seriousness of your predicament. For these hold captive the people and the nation together in the chains of fear and confusion, with a lock upon it fashioned by prideful stubbornness and the paralysis of inaction. As I have said, there are but three kinds of people in a war: soldiers, prisoners, and casualties. Bureaucracy hold hostage those within it who would wish to see it change by fear and paranoia. In this way they are already prisoners thereof to the very thing which they continue to put their trust in. This here being a failing government corrupted by the rigor mortis of endemic ineptitude, one cannot hope to change the very thing which enslaves you to its own rot. For it is like being chained to a corpse animated by the very ones chained to it, who also see their own reflections in it of life and think somehow that it is the corpse which has life and not themselves. For this is the nature of delusion, in the manner with which fear deceives the fearful into externalized mirages of their own making, even as it diverts them from taking the necessary steps to actually breath life back into the dead thing they so ritualistically hold on to, preventing it from resurrecting. It's so essentially looking at the shadow of oneself and calling it the real thing which cast it upon the ground in the first place. No shadow of the real nation-state can hope to have any permanence in such a desolate condition, for it can only lead both the people and their government ever speedily towards a terminal condition where its return to vitality is rendered impossible. You see, it is this playing by the rules and regulations of one's own making that in fact becomes a sort of idolatry of the state, which the state in turn begins to demand of all citizens, marching them all towards tyranny and the abyss of national calamity. This is why I asked, which is greater and of more supreme authority, the rod of the law of God and his staff of grace, or the codex of mortals who have corrupted both themselves and their own laws by corrupting the government which must administer it in degradations? No government which departs from the ordinances of their divine mandate God-given can sustain itself in and of its own volition after becoming an adversary to the very God who granted it reign to begin with as an agent of divine law and grace. It is the moral and ethical responsibility for the citizens of the body politic and those citizens in the governing structures to sacrifice their comforts, positions, risk their reputations and careers at times for the greater good when the nation-state has become ensnared in its own avarice and hubris. We cannot pretend that this republic is greater than that of the higher authority of heaven, nor deceive ourselves that nothing can be done on earth to right the failing edifice of the government that derivates from that higher authority. We must not let fear and potential loss dissuade us from the higher calling, nor its responsibly here to hold our government accountable to it regardless of the costs. The reason why you find yourselves in the predicament you are as a nation is that far too many among you believe the truth less than your enemies and adversaries believe their own lies. Likewise, you also have far too many among you that also believe their lies more than they seek or believe truth. That is a dire portent of great hardships ahead. For us to overcome our present maladies, we must first be willing to see them for what they are and honestly investigate how we arrived here and why. A failure to do so will only worsen our condition as a nation, as the pathologies which are at work continue to infect the totality of the whole. Let us look deeper into some of these pathologies with which our nation has been inflicted. Anomie, lawlessness by another name. Infotype, worldview, philosophy, conceptual framework, global governance. This is a primer on some of the major worldview ideological and philosophical foundations driving what we are seeing in across the 7 spheres of societal influence. The engineering of the managed collapse of the old order is really an attempt to preempt and prevent the actual new order of the kingdom of heaven from manifesting in fullness, by creating the conditions for anomie as a means of deconstructing the perceived threat of 1. Confusion, 2. Accusation, 3. Transference, 4. Displacement, 5. Then discrediting, 6. Slandering, 7. Diluting, 8. Desolation, They hoped to undermine and discredit the Christian worldview and all that was birthed from it to a shadow of itself. Using chaos and fear, this concept of Anami is foundational to the UN's 2030 agenda and the rise of China as the hegemon leader of a new global order based upon integrating elements of unbridled social engineering. 1. Communism with Chinese characteristics. 2. Capitalism with Chinese characteristics. 3. Humanism. 4. Postmodernism. 5. Atheism. 6. Paganism. 7. Corporatocracy. 8. Technocracy. 9. Spiritualized scientism. 10. Transhumanism. 11. Neo-feudalism. 12. Monarchic oligarchies. The concept of Anami is the precursor which creates fear, chaos, and confusion. Anami. 1. Lack of the usual social or ethical standards in an individual or group. The theory that high-rise architecture leads to Anami in the residence. 1930s, from French, from Greek anomia, from anomos lawless. In sociology, Anami is a social condition defined by an uprooting or breakdown of any moral values, standards, or guidance for individuals to follow. Anami may evolve from conflict of belief systems and causes breakdown of social bonds between an individual and the community, e.g., alienation in a person that can progress into a dysfunctional inability to integrate within normative situations of their social world, like to find a job, find success in relationships, etc. The term, commonly understood to mean normlessness, is believed to have been popularized by French sociologist Émile Durkheim in his influential book Suicide. However, Durkheim first introduced the concept of Anami in his 1893 work The Division of Labor in Society. Durkheim never used the term normlessness. Rather, he described Anami as derangement, and an insatiable Durkheim used the term the malady of the infinite because desire without limit can never be fulfilled. It only becomes more intense. For Durkheim, Anami arises more generally from a mismatch between personal or group standards and wider social standards, or from the lack of a social ethic, which produces moral deregulation and an absence of legitimate aspirations. This is a nurtured condition. Most sociologists associate the term with Durkheim, who used the concept to speak of the ways in which an individual's actions are matched, or integrated, with a system of social norms and practices. Anami is a mismatch, not simply the absence of norms. Thus, a society with too much rigidity and little individual discretion could also produce a kind of Anami. History. In 1893, Durkheim introduced the concept of Anami to describe the mismatch of collective guild labor to evolving societal needs when the guild was homogeneous in its constituency. He equated homogeneous skills to mechanical solidarity whose inertia hindered adaptation. He contrasted this with the self-regulating behavior of a division of labor based on differences in constituency, equated to organic solidarity, whose lack of inertia made it sensitive to needed changes. Durkheim observed that the conflict between the evolved organic division of labor and the homogeneous mechanical type was such that one could not exist in the presence of the other. When solidarity is organic, Anami is impossible. As sensitivity to mutual needs promotes evolution in the division of labor, producers, being near consumers, can easily reckon the extent of the needs to be satisfied. Equilibrium is established without any trouble and production regulates itself. Durkheim contrasted the condition of Anami as being the result of a malfunction of organic solidarity after the transition to mechanical solidarity. But on the contrary, if some opaque environment is interposed, relations rare, are not repeated enough ... or too intermittent, contact is no longer sufficient. The producer can no longer embrace the market at a glance, nor even in thought. He can no longer see its limits, since it is, so to speak, limitless. Accordingly, production becomes unbridled and unregulated. Durkheim's use of Anami was in regards to the phenomenon of industrialization, mass regimentation that could not adapt due to its own inertia. More specifically, its resistance to change causes disruptive cycles of collective behavior due to the necessity of a prolonged buildup of sufficient force or momentum to overcome the inertia. Later in 1897, in his studies of suicide, Durkheim associated Anami to the influence of a lack of norms or norms that were too rigid. However, such normlessness or norm rigidity was a symptom of Anami, caused by the lack of differential adaptation that would enable norms to evolve naturally due to self-regulation, either to develop norms where none existed or to change norms that had become rigid and obsolete. In 1938, Robert K. Merton linked Anami with deviance, arguing that the discontinuity between culture and structure have the dysfunctional consequence of leading to deviance within society. He described 5 types of deviance in terms of the acceptance or rejection of social goals and the institutionalized means of achieving them. Etymology. Sidebar. See also Antinomianism. Antinomianism is any view which rejects laws or legalism and argues against moral, religious, or social norms, or is at least considered to do so. The term has both religious and secular meanings. In some Christian belief systems, an antinomian is one who takes the principle of salvation by faith and divine grace to the point of asserting that the saved are not bound to follow the moral law contained in the 10 Commandments. The distinction between antinomian and other Christian views on moral law is that antinomians believe that obedience to the law is motivated by an internal principle flowing from belief rather than from any external compulsion. John Eden, a leader in the Antinomian underground during the 1630s, interpreted Revelation 12:1 with a quote recorded by Giles Furman. "I saw a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet." Scholars have speculated that the sun and light may have been signals of antinomian sympathies. The term anami, a reborrowing with French spelling of anami, comes from Greek anomia, namely the privative alpha prefix, and nomos. The Greeks distinguished between nomos and archi. For example, a monarch is a single ruler, but he may still be subject to, and not exempt from, the prevailing laws, i.e., nomos. In the original city-state democracy, the majority rule was an aspect of archi because it was a rule-based, customary system, which may or may not make laws, i.e., nomos. Thus, the original meaning of anami defined anything or anyone against or outside the law, or a condition where the current laws were not applied, resulting in a state of illegitimacy or lawlessness. The contemporary English understanding of the word anami can accept greater flexibility in the word norm, and some have used the idea of normlessness to reflect a similar situation to the idea of anarchy. However, as used by Emile Durkheim and later theorists, anami is a reaction against or a retreat from the regulatory social controls of society, and is a completely separate concept from anarchy, which consists of the absence of the roles of rulers and submitted social disorder. 19th century French pioneer sociologist Émile Durkheim borrowed the term anami from French philosopher Jean-Marie Gaillard. Durkheim used it in his influential book Suicide in order to outline the social causes of suicide, characterized by a rapid change of the standards or values of societies, and an associated feeling of alienation and purposelessness. He believed that anami is common when the surrounding society has undergone significant changes in its economic fortunes, whether for better or for worse, and, more generally, when there is a significant discrepancy between the ideological theories and values commonly professed and what was actually achievable in everyday life. This was contrary to previous theories on suicide, which generally maintained that suicide was precipitated by negative events in a person's life and their subsequent depression. In Durkheim's view, traditional religions often provided the basis for the shared values which the anomic individual lacks. Furthermore, he argued that the division of labor that had been prevalent in economic life since the Industrial Revolution led individuals to pursue egoistic ends rather than seeking the good of a larger community. Robert King Merton also adopted the idea of anami to develop strain theory, defining it as the discrepancy between common social goals and the legitimate means to attain those goals. In other words, an individual suffering from anami would strive to attain the common goals of a specific society, yet would not be able to reach these goals legitimately because of the structural limitations in society. As a result, the individual would exhibit deviant behavior. Friedrich Hayek notably uses the word anami with this meaning. According to one academic survey, psychometric testing confirmed a link between anami and academic dishonesty among university students, suggesting that universities needed to foster codes of ethics among students in order to curb it. In another study, anami was seen as a push factor in tourism. As an older variant, the 1913 Webster's Dictionary reports use of the word anami as meaning disregard or violation of the law. However, anami as a social disorder is not to be confused with anarchy. Proponents of anarchism claim that anarchy does not necessarily lead to anami and that hierarchical command actually increases lawlessness. Some anarcho-primitivists argue that complex societies, particularly industrial and post-industrial societies, directly cause conditions such as anami by depriving the individual of self-determination in a relatively small reference group to relate to, such as the band, clan, or tribe. See also, acedia, spiritual or mental sloth. Apathy, laodicea, lukewarm, complacent. Groupthink, the practice of thinking or making decisions as a group in a way that discourages creativity or individual responsibility. Mass society is any society of the modern era that possesses a mass culture and large-scale, impersonal, social institutions. A mass society is a society in which prosperity and bureaucracy have weakened traditional social ties. Misanthropy, hatred of mankind. Nihilism, the rejection of all religious and moral principles, in the belief that life is meaningless. Political alienation, psychological resilience. Relativism, social alienation. Strain theory, suicide. Social disintegration, social disorganization theory. The Anom, theory of deviance. A national reality. The malicious code of weaponized warfare. I am sure I am not alone in the frustrations and concern as to the turmoil our nation is in. It would seem that a particularly virulent type of induced insanity has gripped America over the past few years. Regardless of where one stands on the political spectrum, it is hard to deny that something profoundly destructive has taken root in our nation. My response to that perspective is this. Yes, it has. Even so, it may not be what you think it is. Thus is the reason I wrote this article. It will pull back the veil on what it is that is infecting our entire nation and show how it works. It is my hope many will read and consider the implications of what I am going to show you. I ask that but for a moment you try to digest this writing, suspending domestic political bias as much as you are able in order to understand the dire circumstances our entire nation is facing beyond the typical event-driven news cycle. I have no doubt there are those who will dismiss this out of hand and thusly prove some of the very assertions I bring to light. Others will read and see only one side or the other. Still many more will earnestly consider the thoughts herein and find some much-needed clarity as to the why we are seeing and experiencing what we are in our nation. A nation in turmoil, on governance, war, and peace. A few years ago, I drove to Nevada with a good friend of mine. I had some free time to stop by President Eisenhower's hometown. I did so precisely to think about his warning to the American people about the military-industrial complex. It only takes a cursory investigation to see what the effects of war have been on our culture, our people, and the soldiers themselves. No nation has been able to sustain a culture of constant war without devastating effects upon the entirety of the citizenry. The nature of war itself forces human beings to do what is contrary to their own humanity, regardless of their faith and ideological perspectives. The cascade effect of prolonged war upon the society is definitively destructive to the fabric of that society. A warlike society, either by necessity or by choice, ultimately destroys itself by means of those cascade effects of wisdom and discernment, eventually vacating the decision-making process. This can be seen throughout history clearly, and is clear to see in our present age. War makes animals of men and widows of wives. It leaves a vacuum in families and nations. For this reason, it is important for leaders to never enter into the use of force lightly or blind to the subsequent consequences thereof. I am neither a war hawk nor a pacifist. I am a realist, and reality in history bears witness to the carnage of war upon not only the soldiers engaged in it, but upon those who are caught up in the middle of it, who through no fault of their own or choice suffer. The world is filled with suffering, violence, and war. This so because there are some who are forced into it and others that lust for it. This has always been the case. A false peace always gives way to unjust wars. Likewise, unjust wars always give way to suffering and destruction without regard for race, creed, color, or religion. The latter is also true of even just wars. Here wherein is the paradox. How do we maintain a strong defensive posture to act as a check against those who would take advantage of the lack of it, preventing war, and also not continue down the path of the militarization of our entire nation, which threatens the very liberties which it purports to defend and protect? This was exactly the existential crisis Eisenhower was defining in his famous farewell address. Is there a just war? Yes. Is war good? No. It's never a good option. Is it sometimes necessary? Yes. However, when war becomes an industry where it sustains itself by perpetuating more of itself, we have to call this evil and unjust. This was precisely what President Eisenhower was worried about, having seen the horrors of WW2 firsthand, both abroad and at home. This we have to always stand on guard against while maintaining a balance of capabilities in a very turbulent world. So what then is the checks and balances mechanisms we have in place, and what new checks on the growing military-industrial power do we need to put firmly and definitively in place to keep the balance of liberty and security? This is where the conversation gets very complicated indeed. To move forward in the conversation, we must first look at what the Founding Fathers of America put in place. An example: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom to own and protect one's own property without fear of the government co-opting it and stealing it, freedom to bear arms, which is the last line of defense against a tyrannical government. That right is not, as some would have you believe, solely for hunting or even just self-preservation. It has a micro and a macro application. The macro being to provide a reasonable defense posture as a check upon the power of government should it deviate from the freedoms listed in the Constitution. The micro being the right to protect one's own life, liberty, and property as needed from corrupt forces who would seek to plunder the individual citizen and their family. The unity of both the micro and the macro shows the influence of natural law upon the notion of a checks and balance system. That system is in fact self-evident in nature itself. It's this concept that is the genius of the system of government we have. Though imperfect, it is effective when all components of the checks and balances are working as designed and bolstered by a literate, informed, and actively participating citizenry. Here wherein is where the complacency and ignorance of civil duty has allowed corruption to grow unabated in our system. And when that occurs, it always produces confusion, division, paranoia, and destructive consequences. These two serve as a balancing mechanism to wake up the citizenry to their own complacency and ignorance and move them towards action. Action to restore and protect the freedoms of the Constitution and the liberty thereof to live in peace, prosperity, and relative happiness. These freedoms are the foundations of liberty. They are not privileges granted by the government, but are freedoms granted to all people for the well-being of the people, given freely by providence. They are rooted in natural law and objective overarching truth. Those truths are self-evident, meaning that they are obvious and enduring throughout the ages for all generations regardless of the zeitgeist working against it. Those ignorant of these things in our society are co-opted by the very zeitgeist which seeks to take their freedoms away through machinations of various kinds in order to establish tyranny over them. There is the irony. Personal and civic responsibility is a foundation stone for liberty here. Entitlements and selfishness born out of the zeitgeist are the poison to our liberty and seeks to erode the checks and balances which ensure a properly functioning government by and for the people by concentrating power in all its various forms in the unprincipled hands of the few who seek to usurp the liberty of the people in order to enslave them to their evil and unjust selfish ambitions, be them of the domestic or foreign variety. People are free to exercise these freedoms or not, but they are not free to take them away from others or cede them to a government which departs from the reason these freedoms were delineated in the Constitution in the first place. Our government should fear the people, for it exists solely by and for the will of the people, for the maintenance and defense of the freedom of the people. When people fear the government, it passively or actively chooses to be complicit with the violation of not only their own person freedoms, but that of those other citizens who are unwilling to allow such tyranny of mind, body, and spirit to once again enslave to the corruption of the prevailing zeitgeist. The deconstructionists who seek to dismantle the liberty of the people and the people who are complicit with their machinations are in fact enemies to liberty and freedom for all. The checks and balances are designed to push back on all such devious influences by exposing them via the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to vote, and as a last resort the use of arms should the governmental authorities refuse to abide by the checks and balances of the Constitution and rule of natural law, and endeavor to take those freedoms away. It is the duty of those civil servant positions to know this and uphold this at every level in our society, from the local, county, state, and federal civic institutions. Here is why an informed, educated, critically thinking, and actively participating citizenry is so important, and why it has been the target of the zeitgeist. Every single tyrannical government ever established sought to undermine and enslave their citizens and other nations to domination by sowing over time the seeds of discontent, complacency, confusion, fear, suspicion, and division among the greater population. They do this to destabilize the potential for unity among the people in order to keep them in bondage and subdued, so that the masses will not see nor will they rise up to break their chains of oppression put on them by the zeitgeist and those doing the bidding of the zeitgeist. They pretend that they are the source of rights by calling freedoms privileges granted solely by them, subverting the natural law and replacing it with themselves. When a nation goes down this path, calamity is sure to follow. We must not let unprincipled individual interests, leaning towards global corporatocracy, that of our own government, foreign powers, nor those who are ignorant of our nation's civil foundations or any other threat, to dismantle our liberty for the sake of security and false peace. We must not allow complacency and propaganda to mislead us into further confusion, fear, division, and conflict. We must not be in denial of the existential threat we face by groups and nation-states who are pawns of the zeitgeist. We must thusly be willing to call it what it is regardless of the dictates of the politically correctness or socio-political currents in the nation. We must not let those who lust for power wage unjust and unwise wars for profit or any other corrupt reason. We must not allow our leaders to sacrifice life, liberty, and treasure to fight those wars. Likewise, we must not allow those foreign powers who would seek to undermine freedom and liberty go unanswered in their machinations and subversions fashioned to pollute our people with the toxins of weaponized narratives. We must be willing to fight against those who would trample down, subvert, plunder, and destroy our nation that they might feed that bottomless pit of their insatiable lust for wealth, power, and control. We must be slow to act and quick to reason through the actions of our nation and use its collective power and resources wisely for the benefit of all our citizens and the betterment of the other nations. We must be a just people who relentlessly pursue truth and love, allowing justice and mercy to flourish from humble and contrite hearts. We must be self-sacrificing and seek the highest good of one another and those of the other nations. We must not let our prosperity overshadow truth, justice, and liberty. We must stand against corruption no matter where it is found in our own lives and in our nation. We must hold our leaders and the business community to the highest standards of truth and justice and refuse to allow them to act unjustly on our behalf around the world regardless of their attempts to manipulate us. By no means is this long-winded post meant to be exhaustive, though it may be exhausting trolling through it. Many volumes have been written on the matter of civil liberty, and the threats thereof by many people much more knowledgeable than I. My reason for writing on this is to boil it down to precise understanding, discerning the mixture in civil authority. The unfortunate situation we have is that the good public servants in the government pay the price for the poor ones. When people are angry at the government from whichever place on the political spectrum they view it from, they don't recognize all the amazing women and men in the government that are each day working diligently to serve the American people with little to no encouragement or acknowledgement of their hard work. They are often frustrated just like the rest of us at the corruption and inefficiencies and confusion that poor leadership and criminal elements cause. These noble public servants are immersed in the mess day after day, but we often forget that they are us, Americans, fellow citizens who are doing the best they can in a leviathan of bureaucratic red tape and corruption. They, however, are our first line of defense against the entangling serpents of tyranny which seek to co-opt the civil services for subversive and selfish means. This is rarely in the public consciousness due to the ever-flowing stream of power brokers attempting to use the civil government to feed their corrupt ways by manipulating the citizenry and their perceptions via public and private sector means. The corruptive influencers are not limited to domestic weeds alone. Many hostile foreign powers are at work against us. This nation cannot be subverted by the extreme polarity of such people and continue to function improperly. Likewise, the utter narcissism of certain relatively small factions in this nation, who are plentiful in the press and the broader mass media, are attempting to force their short-sighted and untimely twisted agendas upon the entire country in a time of great hardship for many citizens. They are the strain a gnat swallow a camel people who must not be allowed to continue subverting the entire nation in order to follow their lies and self-destructive worldviews. These are those whose allegiances are only with themselves and their twisted selfish desires. They are the bad apples in the apple cart of the nation. They are unprincipled and dangerous to the freedom of all Americans. We must stand against them and their lies. When good men and women refuse to do nothing to stand against evil born of lies and deception, then evil grows unabated like weeds among the fields, choking out the true fruit of liberty, thereby replacing it with a facsimile of the real liberty that is only found and sustained by the truth and love, bringing about justice and mercy for all. One of the greatest enemies of true liberty is fear, for out of fear does come complacency, ignorance, and the confusion and division they ultimately sow among the people. The greatest enemy to true liberty is that of the corruption which is born out of jettisoning the light of the truth in order to serve the lie in the darkness of human hearts. This is an age-old problem. It is the problem of sin and rebellion towards that which is good and true. The standard of truth is not one of human reasoning, but rather the standard of God Almighty, who is the source and the sustainer of true liberty, free from the tyranny of sin which so entangles and enslaves humanity, and keeps humanity individually and collectively in a state of perpetual suffering, and the world embroiled in conflict. This truth, when ignored and cast away from the hearts and minds of people, bring about serious destructive consequences to both the individual and the collective whole. When a nation goes its own way and attempts reserve the right to determine what is good and evil in their own eyes apart from God, such a nation chooses to remove itself from the collective protection that the light of the truth gives freely to all people. The result is a nation in darkness with ever-increasing problems born of the corruption birthed by departing from the way of truth unto the broad path that leads to destruction. When a nation collectively chooses this destructive path, it also chooses the consequences inherent in that choice. Yet in the darkness which descends upon such a nation, the people blame God for the very choices they choose, and God honors them by granting them their own way. They do this despite the warnings and the consequences. Hence why I say it is the way of destruction, and many are there who go within. You are in a much greater war than you might wish to accept, much less even fight. Regardless that war is occurring and is and will leave no person unaffected. The powers that be care little for one's personal preferences other than how they might co-opt them for use in waging war against you and your fellow citizens. Let us look at how they are doing that even now. Present reality from past reality. A proper diagnosis. What you are seeing is what happens when portions of the leadership and population deny objective truth in favor of the pathos of dogmatic subjectivism. Having done so, the society devolves into warring factions bent upon destroying each other, seeing any other point of view as hostile and perceived as threats to be eradicated. What manifests is accusations and conflict. Subjectivism always breaks down to such intellectual, moral, and ethical confusion. It always finds each faction demanding their version of subjective justice while blinded to the fact that their justice is actually unjust because it is born about the relativizing corruption of pride and polluted perception. For no justice can be rendered without objective truth reigning supreme above all subjective points of view. Hence, in demanding justice, they commit injustices, and in committing injustices only worsen their predicament. This creates a destructive feedback loop whose gravity well exerts pulls on all people towards the opposing polarity. Its roots are in pride and fear. Thusly, to maintain their resolute pride, they fuel their own fears with cyclical provocation feedback loops which vacillate between victimizer and victim. The co-opted person exhibits a self-adherence to induced negative archetypal projections of their fears on their perceived opposition. The oppositional polarity serves the function as the binary manufactured validator, fueling the self-referential oppositional paradigm. Provocation greater than reaction greater than provocation equals manufacturing delusion reinforced by a growing self-validating and self-referential cycle greater than self-justifying entitlement, and subsequent demands equals seeks power to force compliance to those demands greater than divisions, and conflicts potentials increase exponentially. Cyclical bipolar macro effects of fear and rage induce confirmation bias fueled social engineering and conflict. How it works. The inorganic nature of the binary extremes is easily seen in its rigidity, increasing irrationality, a refusal to consider anything other than that which confirms their bias. In short, they go dark. The malady begins and acts as a kind of psychosocial malicious code which infects the OS of the individual's thinking. As this malady grows, it seeks to deconstruct all threats in its host and reconstitute the individual's memories, perceptions, cognitive interpretation of data inputs into increasingly overly simplified fight or flight triggering mechanisms, which are then placed into psychosocial rigid constructs which then cause predictable outcomes in social interactions. This predictability equation ensures that no threat or perceived potential threat can expose and deprogram its control over the host, which it uses as proxy to itself. The malicious coded algorithm has to grow to maintain its covert control. Thusly, the code uses the host's subconscious to manufacture self-validating events. This provides necessary diversion for the malicious code to continue spreading from its infected host to others. The pathogenic nature of the malicious code is seen in its intelligent dynamic ability for morphological adaptation in the host's mind to use them as a means of spreading that same code to others. It may co-opt using a tailored approach to configure an individual-specific psychosocial payload into the thinking of the next target of co-opting acquisition. It finds vulnerabilities resident in the targeted individual and reconfigures itself deceptively to gain entry into the individual via their psychosocial vulnerabilities. As the pathogen spreads, the co-opted individuals are used as a collective human shield and as proxy ideological soldiers, with which to wage war against an ever-expanding perceived threatscape which it has in fact self-manufactured. The pathogen then uses this to deepen its hold on its army of host proxies through predictable algorithmic-like cyclical feedback loops in both the micros and macros. Below is the simplified algorithmic flow of the psychosocial malicious code-triggered feedback loop. 1. Individual historical event deconstruction phase. 2. Constructs out of context mixture into a micro-mythos and a macro-mythos. 3. Micro and macro weaponized narrative formed and deployed via 7 spheres of influence. 4. Weaponized narrative seeding and nurturing of its growth in micros and macros. 5. Same process is done in what will become the oppositional polarity. 6. Confusion. 7. Fear. 8. Division. 9. Stress tolerances decrease. 10. Resulting in negative neuroimprinting. 11. Perception distortion. 12. 13. Increased reactive behavior triggering potentials. 14. Fight or flight modality. 15. Increased conflict potential. 16. Event trigger. 17. Predisposed cognitive event-triggered conflict episode. 17. Self-referential validation of initial distorted perceptions and thoughts. 18. Creates increasing cognitive feedback loop severity. 19. Deepens interrelational social divisions. 20. Triggers accusation and attack preemptive behavior. Creates response from target. 22. Target then responds to attacker. 23. Attacker see response as validation of distorted perceptions. 24. Escalation. 25. Cycle repeats as a macro downward spiral feedback loop, increasing intensity and severity of cognitive dissonance, which also increases intensity and severity of behaviors and events. 26. Escalating blowback effect with triggered responses in mirrored cyclical pattern and perceived enemy or threat. 27. Entire feedback continues until destruction and intervention mitigates. The pathology of the binary simulacrum. Neither side cannot maintain its delusion without creating conditions for self-referential validation. Thusly, they accuse, slander, and provoke a scapegoat until the targeted scapegoat responds in blowback on the initial side, thereby unintentionally validating the initiator's distorted perceptions, allowing them to self-justify their original actions against the scapegoat in a self-referential internal false narrative. Manufactured blowback from the extremes. Starts on one side of the extreme of the polarity greater than eventually triggers a dual cyclical downward spiral in the binary. Both sides of the binary engage in this. Both sides play the victim as they accuse, slander, dehumanize, and victimize one another. Both sides provoke one another. They see the separation of powers and the necessary checks and balances mechanism in the nation as an obstacle which they seek to dismantle. The result is lawlessness, unbridled corruption, suffering, and destruction. Micro-macro inversion triggering. How the illusionaries use the false magic of specific events as diversion to create the illusion of appearances and cover their actual intent and actions. While Americans are arguing and fighting one another, the diversion created emboldens those who are the enemies of all people, including the very ones being pitted against one another from the extremes. It is a classic tactic in waging proxy-driven hybrid warfare. It weakens the opponent by using them against themselves while taking advantage of the chaos to achieve tactical and strategic objectives elsewhere. It is patterned and algorithmic in nature when seen in the broader context of the psychosocial, geopolitical, and economic reality. The event-specific myopathy of focusing on the micros like a magician directs the attention of the audience into a narrow band, knowing that they are trying to figure out the trick. The magician uses that to actually trick them. So in looking for the trick, the audience is actually being tricked by a magician who both counts on them to do so, and so has diverted them in such a way as to deceive them using their own logic and perceptions against them to create the illusion, which then shocks the audience. Likewise, the malicious code does a similar thing in the micros and macros using diversion tactics, event triggering, and confirmation bias to deceive both people and nations. As it is for people, so it is for nations. The entropy of the lie. Our foes are extremely clever. They are extremely adaptive and appear to always be one step ahead. But this too is but smoke and mirrors meant to demoralize and wear down, knowing that people are en masse easily manipulated due to short attention spans, the fast pace of the high-tech world, basic day-to-day responsibilities and realities. The magicians of national and geopolitical illusion are able to socially engineer cause and effect triggering by hyper-focusing the public on specific news cycle events which act upon the divided collective consciousness of the nation as a means of diversion, furthering the malicious code's macro level to micro deceptions. This takes on a life of its own as the feedback loops of the binary become mutually self-perpetuating with little active measures involved but to occasionally add additional fuel to the flame through increasing the propaganda flow to one or both sides of the extreme binary, which in fact are working in concert together from the extreme polarities to create the binary oppositional algorithmic downward spiral, attempting to bring all people towards their destruction as the nation atrophies and fractures to a point of terminal effect. Meanwhile, the nation's enemies use this to achieve their strategic and tactical goals, chief among these being the managed degrading of the nation to stand against them even as the nation is devoured and diminished exponentially in power and influence globally, allowing for power, wealth, and influence to be siphoned off to the very ones who intend on replacing them for machinacious and corrupt reasons. It is an inherently beast-like paradigm here. The strategy is a form of unrestricted warfare waged in secret, until the targeted peoples, tribes, and nations are subdued and subjugated to their enemies as slaves. The illusionaries even use their own plans and intents in a weaponized projective tactical as part of their weaponized narrative planted in the targeted country in a kind of macro-level displacement, transference, and projective mechanism. In this way, they are in fact telegraphing what they have been doing, are presently doing, and planning to do, hidden in plain sight, albeit in a clever projected inversion. Thus, you can see how the enemies of the out nation are in fact fully co-opted by the same malicious coding in its advanced state and goal: tyranny and various autocratic constructs. The most obvious nation-state example of this is seen in the North Korean regime and in dictatorial soft power autocratic regimes like Russia and China. They utilize the soft power approach only until such time as they have gained a critical mass of power, wealth, and control. In doing so, they have blinded themselves to their own vulnerabilities, which fuels their own fear from the position of their pride, which always precedes their fall by nature of their own decisions, which exposes them and manufactures their eventual self-destruction. A great predicament, a national desolation, or a turning point. Losing the war, preparing for a war, denying the war already being fought against us. A fool loves war. An idiot starts one without thinking through the consequences. A wise man avoids war, yet when forced to enter into one, knows the cost of being both a fool and an idiot. The best way to win a war is not to have to fight one at all. The best way to lose one is to fight one war when your adversary is fighting quite another. The best way to win a war you have to fight directly is to not fight it by the rules of those who don't have to fight it. War is not something to desire. It is something to always be prepared for if called on to fight the one which was being waged against you long before you get the call from those who suddenly figure that fact out. All visible wars are only the outworking of the invisible war that few see, and even fewer are prepared to fight because they deny that war exists. That invisible war is the one in each heart and mind long before their body shows the effects thereof. It is a spiritual and cognitive war. The kinetic always follows with devastating effects. Defeat in any kind of war is assured when one denies the reality that one's adversaries are already fighting a war against you that you cannot see nor acknowledge. Brutal realism in geostrategic reality. The number one reason America will lose what they currently would consider as the next war is that they do not realize how long and successful China and many others have already been at waging that war against us while avoiding the triggering of a sense of urgency in us as they fuel our pride and arrogance. America does not comprehend the level of long-term damage that has already been done. They are essentially blind to their predicament, thus they have no real sense of urgency to put America on a wartime economy footing. Thusly, they are using the same old playbook which plays right into the hands of our enemies. They anticipated this predictability of our American leadership and have already prepared for it. So as the policy-making and defense industry elite wake up to what they still consider more a future threat having been led by the think tanks, they are emulating the very pathway which will take a decade or more to implement while not acknowledging or possibly even knowing they are already 10 years behind and losing the war they cannot see we are already in. This too our enemies already anticipated. Treating the symptoms will not suffice. We must be cogent and accurate in diagnosing our predicament, or we will remain in a Sisyphus-like paralysis. You can be sure our enemies will make sure to do all they are able to keep us there. They know our weaknesses much more than we do at large. They will exert all manner of means and methods to leverage and exploit them. That would include, if need be, taking us down to our knees as a nation. If COVID-19 did not illustrate this to Washington, D.C. and beyond in the private sector, then I know not what will do it other suffering a great costly defeat. Our enemies are using similar means and methods against us that China and America used to bring down the Soviet Union, which was just part of their longer-term strategy. Likewise, they have strengthened their cohort by means of semi-open source shared stolen IP to level the playing field, even as they have modernized their economies and means of production. During that time, we allowed ours to atrophy to the point of structural failure. Likewise, they undermined our national narratives and cohesiveness while gaining a foothold across the 7 spheres of society. They have fueled our moral, ethical, spiritual, and ideological rot from within and from without, furthering the paralysis and entropy that has been ignored for many decades. This cannot be underestimated if a proper diagnosis and subsequent broad-based and effective solutioneering phase is to be successful. Our enemies know our propensity towards denial as well as our tendency towards relying upon the echoes of what we did in WW2 through true present day. They will not play by our rules but rather surely lock us inside our own. This has been the great failure of all empires throughout history to their own peril. We also cannot underestimate the level of which all of our systems of state, NITSEC and technology have been compromised, for this was also accounted for in their calculations and applied in their strategies decades ago. We resurrected a monster and became one ourselves like it. China is not rising. It has risen, and it is by our own folly, foolishness, greed, pride, avarice, and hubris we made this possible. There is not need to pretend like this is somehow still fig-leaved by our clever attempts to avoid this basic fact. China is also not the only one who has risen nor the last as we fall upon our own swords and deny our predicament. The false framing of this by many in the academic elite and the media has given America a false sense of security and distorted perspective on how much time it has to change course. That too was intended and well executed by their influence operations among other machinations. Now consider what I am saying as simply the tip of a great iceberg which America has already hit and is sinking into the water because of. As we continue to deny anything catastrophic has occurred, that level of folly is exactly how nations exit the stage of their own glories and enter into the winter and dissipation of their power. Denial avails nothing. The ruling elite are lacking in their comprehension of the great chasm which separates them from the majority of Americans. This is particularly true regarding of those who were the first to stand up for the nation's defense in the civilian and veteran population. The morale, trust in government, and anger towards both public and private sectors are more than just foreign influence operations. The social contract with the people themselves have been breached. That too has been all but discounted among the close loop of public and private sector leaders. What I am telling you is that the majority of Americans are either defeated already or they see the governance of the state, the media, academia, and the moneyed interests of the big business which influences them all as anathema to their own interests and well-being, self-inflicted and externally infected and advantaged. This cannot all be blamed on foreign powers. To do so is merely oversimplification and a denial of our own culpability. It is a matter which also falls upon those who were charged with leading America and her citizens on the right path. Instead, they were corrupted and deceived, if not outright complicit with the very hostile forces which are inside the gates of the seven spheres. Americans are this as treasonous and even hostile acts by their own government and business class. The surface appearances of the patina of cynicism is now deeply entrenched into the people, as is a fundamental hatred towards and distrust in the very institutions which were sworn to uphold their most noble virtues and basic interests. This has given way to a public which is steadily becoming openly hostile towards any form of governance over them which is being exploited by internals and external actors to great effect. We just be honest here. Far too many injustices have befallen Americans of all colors and persuasions, even as the nation's leadership has become a flaccid shadow of itself and its disgraces, abuses, and endemic corruptions. I warned of this for many years. It should speak volumes to the ruling caste that most Americans hold them not just in disregard but also in utter disdain. That cannot be turned around simply by reversing the effects of foreign influence operations alone, nor by emulating their means and methods regardless of the intent. Shaping public perception by evil intents are much easier accomplished than shaping them for well-meaning intent to serve virtue. America is on a terminal trajectory. What I am saying here is that the damage has been done. The die has been cast. For authentic change to occur, it will have to occur by a radical shift in thinking, decision-making, and application of methods and means than any of the civilian and national security leadership has dared to consider. I say that because I can clearly see the denial of the present reality and our current predicament not only in how things are being addressed but also in the language of institutional and policy denial throughout the entirety of the whole. We must change course. The dire predicament, as I have attempted to briefly delineate in the most simplistic overview, does not begin to plumb the depths of the actualities which we face as a people. I can tell you this. We have far too many who refuse to understand this predicament and far too little who realize how far the desolation of the nation has gone. Likewise, most do not see that they are already prisoners of the very systems which are now being used against us all to prevent the repair thereof. There is a reason I say of war, and particularly of meta-war. That is but three kinds of people: Soldiers, prisoners, and casualties. We have few soldiers and a growing numbers of prisoners and casualties due to the failure of America's leadership to see this great predicament which overshadows our land and its people. And as I say daily, as for people, so too it is for the nation and the nations. Humility of heart and sobriety of mind. We can only overcome that which we are willing to admit as a real and present situation, not just a future potential threat. The first step is admitting one as a problem. The actual problem one is I'm not the symptoms thereof. For into then can the steps forward towards addressing the problem as it is not as one wished it would be. Permit me to leave you with this last thought. You cannot stop a coming war when you are already in it. You can only acknowledge that you are in it and deal with it without the blinders of denial on, or else you will only worsen the war you are already in as it overtakes both your denial and your fears, making the potential to limit it or end it all but impossible. The first domain of war is the one in your own hearts and minds. Until you understand this and accept you cannot extricate yourself from it in your own wisdom and works, you will only march steadily towards oblivion. Why? Put quite simply, because of pride. You cannot forge an authentic lasting peace for the same reason. Nothing authentic can be built upon the foundation of pride, avarice, and hubris. One cannot put their hope in a false peace when it is itself a method of war. Until you see yourself as you are, you will not see others as they actually are, nor the world as it actually is, ensuring that both you and the others will be blinded by the very things which cause your destruction. This is your paradox. Sincerely and humbly, I submit these thoughts to you for consideration. As for people, so too for the nation and nations. Othniel Max Daves.